This playlist collects and organizes the segments of the lecture on Dr. Elaine Scarry's 5 objections to Dershowitz. As usual, we'll start by talking a little bit about Dr. Scarry, who she is, and what she does, the scope of her research, and so on. Then we'll look at her criticisms. She organizes her 5 criticisms into 2 groups. The first group she associates primarily with criticisms of the ticking bomb scenario itself, and the first objection that she raises supposes that the proposal for warrants is introduced and justified by Dershowitz because it's necessary for people who torture in ticking bomb scenarios to have legal cover. Otherwise, they wouldn't necessarily perform that action, and the people would, as a result, die. The greatest good wouldn't be produced. The second criticism she offers claims that the warrant mechanism, the process of judicial review, even if it could be done in the highly compressed time period suggested by a ticking bomb case, wouldn't provide as reliable or trustworthy a assessment of whether or not torture is warranted in these cases as one's convictions, given that one doesn't want to perform that violent act. But it's necessary in order to save other people. She thinks that conviction, I don't want to do this, it's an awful thing, nevertheless, I want to save these people. Reaching that conviction is a better assessment of whether or not a particular case falls under the category of ticking bomb than judicial review would be. And finally, she argues that the ticking bomb scenario supposes superhuman epistemic abilities on the part of the participants. People have to know so much about their terrorist suspect, about the likely success of the torture, and so on, that it seems really unrealistic burden to place on people. When we turn our attention to her criticisms of the actual warrant proposal, her first criticism suggests that warrants aren't really going to provide a mechanism that raise visibility and provide more general accountability, as Dershowitz alleges they will. And her fifth and final criticism argues that the introduction of warrants and the sanctioning of classes of cases that where torture is deemed acceptable will actually work to undermine current mechanisms to monitor the occurrence of torture and to prevent torture that are already in place and that are already actually fairly effective. So this is Dr. Elaine Scarry. She's a full professor in the English department at the University of Harvard. Her official position is the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and General Theory of Value at Harvard University. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including the books On Beauty and Being Just and Dreaming by the Book. And her response to Dershowitz is published in the same collection of articles where Dershowitz's Tortured Reasoning, our article from Dershowitz, is published. And as I mentioned, her article offers 5 criticisms of Dershowitz's position on torture, associating 3 with the ticking bomb case, and then 2 explicitly with the ability of warrants to promote democratic ideals and minimize torture. So she lists off her criticisms of the ticking bomb scenario, which are really criticisms of warrants as being essential to the ticking bomb scenario. Now I'll give them in the order she gives them, but I'll cover them in the lecture by talking about the first and the third first and finishing with the second. So her first criticism alleges that the ticking bomb argument assumes that we need warrants in such situations because otherwise the population as a whole will be too, as she puts it, cowardly and self-regarding a bill to torture in order to save other people. They would be unwilling to risk their own imprisonment or other punishment to save the lives of these other people, and hence the warrant proposal is a bad idea that doesn't reflect the real constitution of the potential agents in a ticking bomb scenario. Now, the second objection suggests that the ticking bomb scenario requires knowledge on the part of the agents who apprehend the terrorists and determine that this is the ticking bomb scenario. That's really beyond what can even plausibly be expected by incredibly highly trained and well-funded professionals in a coherent organization. And so she thinks that it's really unlikely that people would be in a position to know that they were in a ticking bomb scenario. And the third objection that she raises argues that, again, this introduction of warrants would actually introduce a less trustworthy, less reliable way of determining whether or not you're in a ticking bomb scenario. So she suggests that it would undermine people's felt aversedness to the cruelty that's involved in acts of torture, and hence would undermine people's ability to assess their conviction that they are uniquely in this position to save the lives of all these people, and they're so sure of it that even though they definitely don't want to do these horrible things, they feel that's absolutely necessary. And so what she's essentially alleging is that that criterion, our sort of gut assessment of the situation, is in fact a more reliable, trustworthy criterion than the sort of judicial review that we might get. And this doesn't really speak to the idea of whether or not such a judicial review could occur on a compressed time frame like this. People could gather up the evidence, the judge could go over the evidence and issue the warrant. All of that takes time. That's not her criticism. Her criticism essentially is a bunch of judges following a set of regulations and looking at the evidence that's presented to them would be less good at judging whether or not they're really in a ticking bomb scenario than someone who's in the emotional thick of it themselves.